Hello everybody, I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes. Welcome to the series about stuff vaguely relating to anger or upset. Books that Dad picked on a theme, anger. As the subtitle says, I probably need a better title, but I'm never going to pick one. So this particular book is less about people in the book being angry or about people being angry specifically at the book, and more about the general societal trend of anger about a central point of this particular book. This book is Quentin Crisp's The Naked Civil Servant, and this book isn't a novel. This is an autobiography. And in this book, Quentin Crisp talks about life as being openly homosexual, as he says, in immediately pre-Second World War, during Second World War, and post-Second World War England. This book was published in 1968, and the thing is that this is a book that was published not long after being homosexual ceased to be an actual specific crime in England. The thing is that, as many of us know, for a great many years it was functionally illegal to be openly gay, to do homosexual things in public places. There was, of course, a certain amount of laxity in enforcement, if only because you don't want to take the risk that this is not a gay man, but in fact a totally heterosexual one who's dressed up for a fancy dress party somewhere, who is wearing a dress because that was his costume to the party, not because it's how he likes to dress. But it's the anger in relation to this book really has to do with, and it is something that he talks about a lot, and it is this notion that people at the time, but even still today, those who are so inclined to think this way tended to just automatically be angry at homosexual men. People tended to be less angry at lesbians because lesbians are a staple of pornography, and thus you don't get angry at them, you just leer. Whereas gay men are threatening in some way. A friend of mine once theorized that it's because a lot of men believe that the way they are supposed to act around women involves a lot of sexual aggressiveness, and they are concerned if the sexual aggressiveness that they consider fundamental to masculine behavior, if that they think, oh dear, what if that were turned on me? That would be bad. It doesn't make them rethink their attitudes towards women necessarily, but they do become concerned that somebody might do that to them. And the thing that I actually found most interesting in this was not the numbers of people who are constantly trying to beat him up, because that is not really shocking if you know anything about the treatment that the LGBTQ plus community has traditionally undergone. What I found most interesting is that at the start of this book, he unrelentingly describes himself as a supremely unpleasant person. Just unrelentingly describes himself as somebody who cries as a matter of course, not because he is genuinely upset, but because that's just what he does, and because it's good for manipulation. He says a lot of these things, and they make him seem to be genuinely unpleasant and genuinely the sort of person that it didn't matter if he was gay, you would have wanted to smack him anyways. And there's an odd feeling looking back on it by the time you get to the end of the book that whether it's something, a learned belief about himself, or whether it's just his more feminine tendencies being misread and then fed back to him as being seen that way, who knows, that there is a sense in which this unrelenting introduction of himself as unpleasant is a strange sort of effort at justifying poor behavior other people committed towards him on some level or other. And I'll be honest, it's very, very hard to tell, partly because for a large portion of this book, he is determinedly unapologetic. In particular, he talks about his decision very specifically to not bother to pass as normal. He has chosen very specifically to dress in deliberately effeminate ways, to very deliberately wear makeup, to dress in particular ways that were openly and flauntingly queer, and that was sort of his effort as a young man to garner acceptance, to be a one-man gay pride parade. And this, of course, had a tendency to cause him to get beaten up in the unemployment line and have various other difficulties. But it's very, very interesting, this book, because on the one hand, it's clear that being gay was very, very central to his existence, but I think one of the lines that I think is most delightful in this is that he doesn't make absolutely everything in this book about being gay, in that, yes, of course, it's very, very central to his existence, and you can't take that away from a person, but at the same time, a person is more than his or her sexuality. Or their, pardon me. If you like men, or like women, or like nobody at all in that way, those things don't affect whether or not you prefer listening to particular kinds of music. They don't affect what kinds of novels that you prefer to read. And yes, of course, you may prefer to read stories with queer storylines as opposed to heterosexual storylines, but that's not going to affect whether you prefer science fiction or fantasy or, more traditional real-world fiction or mystery novels. Those are all things that are not going to be affected very directly by your being gay. It's not going to affect whether you are talented at music or supremely untalented. It's not going to affect any of those things. Everybody is more than a single aspect of their personality. And so he very determinedly discusses things like his ongoing generosity to people in his life, even though he really couldn't afford it. He talks about the fact that he kept on getting these jobs in things like advertising, but that he was not remotely detail-oriented, and that being not detail-oriented meant that he was continually not able to keep those jobs because he just wasn't mentally inclined to do the work well. He talks about becoming a model and the fact that he liked to take poses that were hard for the students to draw, and they all hated him because as an artist's model, if you're a student, you want your model to be in a position that is not difficult to draw, that doesn't have problematic foreshortened bits and things that you don't quite yet know how to make look real because, a hand much closer to you than the other hand is going to look much bigger, and you have to learn the tricks of the trade to make it look bright, and all of that kind of stuff. And these are aspects of a personality that he describes about himself that are wonderful, because they make this book about more than just being gay. It's about the whole of his life, the difficulty that he has with his father, which, yes, was probably partly because he was open and flamboyantly gay, but the fact that he says that his father complained that he was expensive suggests that his father may have also had other issues, like the fact that children are expensive and he wasn't happy about having a son because his son was expensive and he didn't like having to put up with additional expense in his life. And there are so many things, events, parts of his life that he talks about. He goes on to talk about during World War II and how everybody was so much kinder and more generous and a whole bunch of other things, which, of course, it's the kind of thing that duress does tend to cause a lot of people to be kinder and more generous because we have a certain amount of human sympathy in certain kinds of situations that will tend to evaporate once those situations evaporate. And all of these things that he discusses, they connect to and they relate to who he is in terms of being flamboyantly gay, but it's not only about that, and it's really, really delightful as a read in terms of discussing the whole of a life, not just the memoir of this one aspect of his life. The final couple chapters of the book where he talks about the post-war world, in particular the fact that, of course, he is in his 40s at the end of the Second World War. He's gotten to the point now where he's starting to get old, where he's no longer, a young 20-something sashaying down the walkways, that he's in his 40s, closing in on his 50s, and, as he puts it, as the differentiation between the sexes reduced, he became more and more, and the way that he'd always dressed that had seemed so flamboyant has started to become the way that young people dressed, and that he found that he felt like these younger people, these teenagers, often felt like he was trying to pretend to be one of them, when it was just that he had always dressed that way, and it's an interesting thought, of course, to have somebody dress in a way that's seen as flamboyant or indecent in one age, but that as social mores change, how you dress becomes how all the young people dress, except then the young people think that you're imitating them rather than realizing that you were a precursor rather than, following in their wake. It's an interesting, there's a lot of interesting bits in this book conceptually, and indeed this particular book, this book is, they describe this as I don't know, witty and riotous. Witty, yes. Sardonic, yes. But I find that I think a little bit, the humor is perhaps a little bit too sharp for me to find it necessarily funny. It sometimes feels like he's a little bit too sharp and a little bit too real to really connect with me in terms of being riotously funny. I mean, this is a very, very good read. It's an interesting read. It's an entertaining read. It's very much a page-turner, and if you're interested in autobiography or queer stories, it's absolutely worth the read. But I'm not sure how many people will necessarily find it very, very funny. It's amusing. It has its funny moments to me, but maybe not quite to my taste. Anyway, I've hit the end of my particular time limit, self-imposed time limit, so that's everything, and I will see you all next week.